An independent review of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees has found that Israel has yet to provide supporting evidence of its accusations UNRWA employees are members of Hamas and linked to the October 7th attacks on Israel. The report by a former French foreign minister found staffing lists had regularly been provided for vetting since 2011, but Israel did not raise concerns. Since that claim was made in January, many countries cut their funding to UNRWA, including the biggest funders, the US, Germany, and the EU. UNRWA supports 5.9 million people across 5 territories: Gaza, the occupied West Bank, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria, often providing the basic necessities of life, from food to schools and even infrastructure in refugee camps. We'll bring in Gabriel Elizondo, who's joining us now from the United Nations headquarters in New York. Gabriel, what is the takeaway message from this report, and what more are we learning at this hour?
I think the takeaway message is very clear that this report gives a clean bill of health to UNRWA when it comes to the issues of neutrality. In fact, they don't have any issues of neutrality. That's the major takeaway here. This report by Catherine Colonna and 3 European human rights organizations was an independent report. It lasted nearly 3 months for them to collect data. They spoke to over 200 different people in interviews, reviewed thousands of documents, and visited UNRWA offices and other offices in the region to reach their conclusions. I'll read a couple key lines from here. When it comes to neutrality, the report states that UNRWA possesses a more developed approach to neutrality than other similar UN or NGO entities, a more developed approach. It also said that when it comes to UNRWA staff members, 32,000 of which work for UNRWA, it said that UNRWA regularly gives entire lists of their employees' information to Israel, and at no time has Israel, since 2011, ever come back to UNRWA to say that they had any problem with any of the UNRWA employees. UNRWA has extensive vetting processes, according to this report, and vetting processes that are reviewed periodically, including with their freelancers. They have 5,000 employees that are not full-time staff members, and they go through the same vetting process and the same neutrality training that the full-time staff members do. And in conclusion, as you mentioned, the report states that Israel, of course, has identified what they say are 12 UNRWA employees that took part in October 7th and are affiliated with Hamas. This report says, confirms what we've been hearing from the Secretary General's spokesperson for many months now, that Israel has given no evidence of that to the investigators during this report and their findings.
All right. Thank you so much, Gabriel Elizondo. Thanks for that update from the United Nations. Here's a look at UNRWA's assistance for Palestinians. So the UN agency supports nearly 6 million Palestinian refugees right across the Middle East. It runs 706 schools and 140 primary healthcare facilities. It also provides food and cash assistance to more than 1.8 million Palestinians, most of them in Gaza. It employs about 13,000 staff, 178 of whom have been killed in the Israeli attacks since October the 7th. More than 164 UNRWA facilities have been destroyed during the war. And the U.S. is the agency's biggest donor. In 2023, it contributed $422 million to UNRWA. We can now bring in Chris Gunness, who's a former UNRWA spokesman, joining us from London. As someone who knows the agency so well, Chris Gunness, just give me your sort of initial reading to the findings of this report.
Well, I welcome this report, and I think UNRWA will welcome it because it confirms that UNRWA is an indispensable lifeline for the people of the Middle East, the refugees. It also confirms UNRWA has established significant number of mechanisms and procedures to ensure compliance with humanitarian principles, particularly neutrality. And it says UNRWA possesses a more robust approach to neutrality than any other UN or NGO organization. This is key because right now there's this big debate about should other agencies take over, should World Food Programme do the food distributions in northern Gaza? Well, Colonna is saying UNRWA has better neutrality mechanisms than all of these others. And perhaps most significant, Kelowna is saying clearly that though Israel has made these public claims about a large number of UNRWA employees that they are allegedly members of terrorist organizations, Israel has yet to provide supporting evidence of this. In other words, these allegations that triggered this crisis remain unsubstantiated. It would seem that the Israeli claims amount to the mother of all lies based on a dodgy dossier. And if I may just make one last point on the curriculum, which, this is often used as a stick to beat UNRWA, the technical report on which the Kelowna report is based says very clearly that UNRWA has, and I quote, it's responsive to criticism of its textbooks and has initiated a range of initiatives to ensure neutrality of the teaching material. It finds that UNRWA's education policies, updated guidelines and manuals have become robust and adequate for purpose. That, I think, is a ringing endorsement of UNRWA, even though it comes up with some proposals for donor relations and staff oversight. But by and large, I'm delighted with this report, and I think UNRWA will embrace it.
Before we talk about the proposals, let me just ask you this. I mean, during your time at UNRWA, did you ever witness sort of violations of the principles of humanitarian neutrality? And how rigorous were the standards of neutrality for UNRWA?
Well, let's talk about the context, because when you're dealing with occupation, blockade, the dispossession of the Palestinians that began in 1948, well, of course, there are going to be some bad apples. And yes, of course, in the situation of war, there will be neutrality problems. The key test is not the problems, but how UNRWA has responded. And UNRWA, as Kelowna has found, has robust mechanisms in place. I am lived experience of the fact that whenever there were credible reports of neutrality violations, UNRWA would always investigate, disciplinary action would always be taken up to and including dismissal from the agency. And guess what? We did that for years to the satisfaction of our major donors. In 2017, for example, there was a major audit by the American Government Audit Office. And after that root and branch audit, they carried on giving UNRWA $350 million a year. And that's why I say to the UK in particular, but others, they need to look at this report and say, we are providing you with a ladder on which to climb down to come back. It's clear that UNRWA processes are robust and there is no longer any reason to continue withholding money from this agency, which is doing life-saving work across the Middle East.
Will these suggestions put forward in the report, such as expanding the capacity of the Internal Oversight Service, providing more in-person training, more support from donor countries, do you think that these proposals are enough to appease those donors that have cut funding, like the UK and the US?
Well, the donors know full well that in partnership with them, UNRWA has been using these very mechanisms that Kelowna is highlighting for years. So yes, I think the donors know very well that UNRWA does have these donor relations mechanisms, these oversight mechanisms in place. Yes, of course, more can always be done, but I think the donors know very well what is there because UNRWA has been working transparently with them for decades, implementing this robust zero tolerance policy. So yes, it's time for the donors to come back.
Okay, Chris Gunness, thank you. We thank you for joining us out of London.
Thank you very much.
We're now joined by our diplomatic editor, James Bays, here in the studio. James, how damning is this report for Israel?
Well, Israel has made some very, very serious allegations. If you make serious allegations, normally you're supposed to come up with some evidence to prove those allegations. The UN has repeatedly said that it has not been provided with this information. There's a separate report being done by the Office of Internal Oversight. That's another part of the UN. They haven't got the information they want from Israel. So if Israel's not providing the evidence, why is Israel not providing the evidence? And are these completely unfounded allegations? That is the simple question that is begged by the situation on the ground.
And when it comes to this issue that I was just discussing actually with Chris Gunness, he raised it. That's one of the allegations that Israel puts forward is that UNRWA schools across the region use textbooks with anti-Semitic content in them. I'm not sure if you've taken a look at the entire report, but from what you've seen, has there been any evidence of that whatsoever?
And that is a repeated allegation that's been made by Israel. No, there isn't. And I think it's worth saying that there are many figures in Israel who do not want UNRWA to exist. They've long not wanted UNRWA to exist. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is because UNRWA provides state-like services. And yes, it's operated by the UN as a UN agency, but it's Palestinians doing the work. So it is a sort of part of a de facto Palestinian state. Also, UNRWA doesn't just work in East Jerusalem, Gaza and the West Bank. It also works in Syria, in Lebanon, in Jordan. UNRWA is that link between the Palestinians who are there on Palestinian soil and the refugees who want a right to return, who the UN, when it set up UNRWA, was assuming were going to go back home. And that's a link that Israel doesn't like at all. Because
that goes against the Israeli long-standing policy of not returning refugees.
Absolutely.
What about the issue of... When the allegations came out back in January, we saw a whole host of countries, of course, cut their funding to UNRWA, some which restored it. But we know that the UK and the US still have not. Do you think that this report is going to make a difference?
This is where the damage, I think, has already been done, because there is now a bill that's gone through Congress saying the US is not allowed to restore the funding to UNRWA until 2025. Well, the US... last year, it was $371 million. That's a third of the funding from UNRWA, at a time when UNRWA are the main body on the ground doing the work with such a dreadful cost to their staff on the ground. UNRWA is needed more than ever, many would say, and that dent of a third of the funding from the US, and that's not coming back. We know that because of congressional legislation. In the UK, they were waiting for this Kelowna report, but already in the ruling Conservative Party, very pro-Israel MPs, quite prominent some of them, are saying, no, we shouldn't give the funding. So these allegations, even though there's no evidence to support the allegations, are still doing damage, and that means damage to those people on the ground in Gaza, those that so desperately need humanitarian aid, a place where people have had nearly 7 months of bombardment and where people are dying now of famine.
OK, and we'll wait to see what impact this report actually has. But for the time being, James Bates, thank you so much.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.